After that Tuesday afternoon, the station never sounded the same again. By nightfall, the story had already escaped the building. It moved through group texts, late phone calls, half-whispered conversations between city employees who knew better than to ask questions out loud. Something had happened inside the precinct during shift change. Something ugly, something public, something the department had never fully lost control of before. The rumor everyone repeated was simple. A black man had been grabbed by the throat in the lobby, slammed against the wall, right there under the fluorescent lights. Mid-shift change. Dozens of officers walking past, no one stepping in. But the violence was not what made the city uneasy. It was the silence afterward. The cameras that were never supposed to fail suddenly mattered. The radio logs that usually vanished into routine paperwork were being requested. People who had learned to look away found themselves replaying the moment in their heads, wondering who else had noticed what they noticed. Officer Craig Mitchell felt it first. He told himself it was nothing. Just another loud afternoon, another situation that had gotten out of hand and would be written up the usual way. But the sound of that man's voice kept circling back, calm and steady, in a way that did not fit the chaos. "I'm here for a scheduled matter," the man had said, even while Mitchell's hand was wrapped around his throat. No shouting, no begging, just control. That was what unsettled Mitchell now. Not the accusation, not the witnesses, the voice. Sergeant Linda Wilson noticed it too, though she would never admit it out loud. 18 years on the job had taught her how to read patterns, how to feel when the air in a building shifted. Officers who usually joked through paperwork stayed quiet. Dispatch took longer to answer. Supervisors avoided eye contact. Wilson stood in the hallway outside IR3, arms crossed, watching the floor as if it might offer instructions. She had covered situations like this before. She had smoothed reports, corrected language, protected the department from embarrassment. This felt different. Someone in records asked for camera access they never asked for. Dispatch mentioned federal inquiry protocols in a tone that sounded almost rehearsed. A probationary officer had requested timestamps with a formality that did not match his rank. Mitchell paced the locker room, replaying the moment again and again. The way the man had looked at him. Not angry, not afraid. Just aware. "You don't have to do this," the man had said quietly. Mitchell had laughed then, dismissed it. Another voice, another complaint, another nobody who thought words mattered more than power. Now that same voice echoed in his head as radios crackled outside the door and phones buzzed unanswered. Wilson finally broke the silence. "We followed procedure," she said, more to herself than to Mitchell. He nodded too fast. "Yeah, we did." But neither of them believed it anymore, because procedures do not make seasoned officers nervous. Cameras do, and somewhere between the lobby and the back hallway, between the chokehold and the calm refusal to panic, a line had been crossed that could not be written away. Mitchell sat down, hands trembling slightly. He could still hear the man's tone, steady as a clock. Not a threat, not a warning, a promise. And without understanding why, Craig Mitchell felt the certainty settle in his chest that whatever future he thought he controlled had already begun to change. 3 years earlier, Brandon Harris dialed 911 because he was scared. His voice shook as he spoke to the dispatcher, words tumbling out too fast, breath uneven. He said he could not slow his thoughts. He said his chest felt tight. He said he needed help, not trouble. He said he was alone and afraid of what might happen if no one came. The dispatcher did what the system trained her to do. She logged the call. She tagged it as a welfare check with possible mental health distress. She asked Brandon to stay where he was and to keep his hands visible when officers arrived. Brandon promised he would. When Craig Mitchell heard the call come over the radio, he rolled his shoulders like someone getting ready for a workout. Another unstable male, another situation that could go sideways. He did not hear fear. He heard risk. Sergeant Linda Wilson arrived minutes later. She took in the scene quickly. Brandon was pacing, talking to himself. His hands moved when he spoke, not threatening, just restless. The mental health unit had been requested. They were on the way. Wilson looked at Mitchell and shook her head slightly. "We don't need them," she said. "This will be quicker." Mitchell agreed. Quicker meant control. Control meant no surprises. They told Brandon to sit. He asked why. They told him to be quiet. He said he was trying. When he stood up too fast, Mitchell grabbed his arm. "Brandon, pulled back instinctively, panic rising. That was all it took. Later, the report would say he became aggressive, that he resisted, that force was necessary. What the report did not say was how Brandon begged them to slow down, how he said he could not breathe, how he asked for his brother by name. Andrew Harris arrived after the call from the hospital. By the time he got there, Brandon was already gone. Andrew was a former Marine. He had spent years in rooms where tension could explode with one wrong word. He knew how systems worked. He believed in procedure, in documentation, in accountability. At first, he trusted it. He filed requests. He asked questions calmly. He listened as officers explained that his brother had suffered a medical emergency, that no one was at fault, that sometimes these things happened. The file closed quickly, too quickly. The family statements were summarized, not quoted. The body camera footage was missing. The medical examiner used language that felt copied from somewhere else. Local media repeated the same phrases over and over. Troubled individual, tragic outcome, no evidence of wrongdoing. Andrew watched it all happen and told himself to be patient. If we follow the process, he said to his mother, the truth will surface. But weeks turned into months. Complaints disappeared into internal review. Emails went unanswered. The union released a statement. The department moved on. Craig Mitchell received a commendation that year. Linda Wilson was transferred to evidence oversight. Deputy Chief Raymond Walsh signed off on the final report without meeting the family. Andrew finally understood what the system was protecting. Not order, not safety. It was protecting itself. The illusion was not that justice would come. The illusion was that it had ever been invited. For 18 months, Andrew Harris stayed in the background, not because he lacked power, not because he lacked proof, but because he needed to understand the shape of the thing he was fighting. He worked quietly with federal investigators, with a small reform team inside City Hall, with lawyers who spoke in careful sentences and never put anything in writing unless it could survive court. Files stacked up. Timelines aligned. Names repeated themselves in places they should not have appeared twice. It would have been enough to act, but Andrew hesitated. He had learned something during his years in crisis negotiation. Systems do not reveal their truth when they know they are being watched. They perform, they posture, they protect themselves. So he made a decision no one advised him to make. I want to walk in alone, he said during a late meeting with the federal liaison. The man across the table frowned. You don't need to do that. We already have probable cause. I'm not looking for cause. Andrew replied, I'm looking for culture. The room went quiet. Andrew explained it simply. He wanted to know how the station treated a black man with no title attached to his name, no uniform, no announcement, no warning. I want to hear the real voice, he said, the one they use when they think no one important is listening. They warned him about the risk, about escalation, about officers who would not recognize restraint as restraint. Andrew nodded. He already knew. The night before he went in, he barely slept, not from fear, but from memory. His brother's voice on the phone, the way Brandon had sounded small when he asked for help, the way the system had answered with force. If nothing had changed, Andrew needed to see it with his own eyes. Across the city, Officer Tyler Brooks sat at his kitchen table staring at his badge. 6 months on the job. Still on probation, still careful with every word he said inside the station. He had joined because he believed policing could be better than what he grew up seeing. He was learning quickly how dangerous that belief could be. At dispatch, Clara Williams had been keeping logs for 25 years. She knew which calls vanished and which ones were rewritten. She knew which supervisors asked questions and which ones closed doors. She had learned to keep copies, not because she thought it would save anyone, just in case one day someone finally asked. Andrew did not know their names yet, but the choice he was about to make would force all their paths to cross. And once they did, there would be no turning back. Andrew chose the day carefully. Tuesday. Shift change, late afternoon, when the building was loud enough to hide small violations and busy enough to expose big ones. He dressed like someone who had nothing to announce. No suit, no jacket, just a dark shirt, clean jeans, shoes worn enough to look ordinary. He left his credentials at home. What he carried instead was restraint. Inside the station, Tyler Brooks adjusted his chair at the dispatch desk and tried to ignore the tension that always crept in around 5:30. Veterans joked louder than usual. Supervisors rushed paperwork. Everyone wanted to be seen leaving on time. Tyler had learned to watch moments like this, not because training told him to, because his gut did. When the front doors opened and Andrew stepped inside, Tyler noticed him immediately. Not because he looked dangerous, because he didn't. Calm posture, measured steps, eyes scanning the room the way someone does when they're assessing tone, not exits. Craig Mitchell noticed him too. Mitchell's reaction came from muscle memory, the assumptions, the reflexes no one admitted they were taught. He moved before Andrew reached the desk. Tyler felt his stomach drop. From dispatch, Clara Williams watched the interaction unfold through the glass reflection. She recognized the choreography instantly, the angle of Mitchell's body, the way Sergeant Wilson slowed her walk just enough to arrive after first contact, not before. Clara reached for a notepad she wasn't supposed to be using anymore. Andrew spoke first, his voice level. "I'm here to speak with a supervisor." Mitchell didn't answer the question. He asked a different one, the wrong one. "What are you doing in my station?" The word "my" landed heavy. Andrew answered calmly. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He did not shrink. That was the mistake. Tyler watched Mitchell close the distance, watched his hand come up too fast, watched Andrew's shoulders tense but his hands stay visible. Tyler's phone was already in his pocket. He didn't think about it. He just pressed record. Clara began pulling timestamps, radio channels, camera IDs. She had done this before, quietly, for years, but never this fast, never with this much certainty that someone would finally need it. Andrew heard Mitchell's voice change, heard the edge sharpen, heard the tone people used when they believed they were in control. "This doesn't have to be difficult," Andrew said. Mitchell laughed. That laugh was the voice Andrew had come to hear. Not anger, not chaos, confidence. The belief that nothing would happen next. When the first hand closed around Andrew's collar, Tyler's breath caught. When Andrew didn't fight back, didn't shout, didn't threaten, Tyler understood something important. This man wasn't here to win a confrontation. He was here to reveal one. Clara's fingers moved faster. She marked the exact second the interaction escalated. She flagged the camera angle she knew still worked, even when others mysteriously failed. Andrew felt the room shift the moment he was pulled away from the desk. Not fear, confirmation. The system was answering him honestly now. As he was led toward the back hallway, Andrew caught Tyler's eye for half a second. There was no plea in it, just recognition. Tyler swallowed hard and kept recording. That was when Andrew understood something he had not expected. Justice does not always begin with authority. Sometimes it begins with a young officer who hasn't learned how to look away yet. Sometimes it begins with a dispatcher who never threw anything out. Sometimes it begins with someone deciding that a calm voice, recorded at the right moment, can be stronger than any badge. Andrew stepped into the hallway knowing there was no return to anonymity now. The choice had been made, and the system had spoken. It happened at exactly 5:30 p.m. The lobby was full in the way police stations always were at shift change. Boots on tile, radios crackling, laughter near the coffee machine. A sergeant walked past carrying a paper cup, eyes forward, already done for the day. Andrew took 3 steps inside before Craig Mitchell spoke. "Another black thug thinking he can just walk into my station." The word hit harder than the hand that followed. Mitchell closed the distance fast, fingers clamping around Andrew's throat, driving him backward until plaster cracked behind his head. The sound echoed through the lobby, sharp and unmistakable. Andrew's vision blurred for a moment, but he did not cry out. Around them, the room froze. Dozens of officers saw it. Some looked away immediately. Some pretended not to notice. One kept talking mid-sentence like nothing had changed. No one stepped in. Andrew felt the pressure on his airway increase. He focused on breathing slowly, deliberately, the way he had taught others to do in moments of panic. "I'm here to speak with a supervisor," he said, voice strained but controlled. Mitchell leaned closer. "You don't get to make requests." He ripped the visitor badge from Andrew's jacket and threw it to the floor. Then he spat near Andrew's shoes. "Your kind doesn't belong here." Sergeant Linda Wilson arrived seconds later, not running, not alarmed, just in time. She took in the scene, Mitchell's grip, Andrew pressed to the wall, the silent witnesses. She did not tell Mitchell to let go. Instead, she said calmly, "What's the issue?" "He won't say why he's here," Mitchell replied without looking at her. Andrew met her eyes. "I need to speak with your watch commander. This was arranged." Wilson studied him for a beat too long. Then she nodded once. "Come with us." The hand released Andrew's throat, only to clamp onto his arm. Mitchell pulled him toward the back hallway, hard enough to stumble. Andrew did not resist. He kept his hands visible, kept his steps measured. That restraint infuriated Mitchell more than shouting ever could. From the dispatch desk, Tyler Brooks watched it all happen. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. This was not training. This was not procedure. This was something else. His thumb pressed the screen of his phone, recording. At the same time, Clara Williams began pulling up channel logs. She marked the second the lobby camera should have caught the first contact. She copied the radio traffic before anyone could clean it up. Andrew was shoved down the hallway toward IR3. Behind him, the lobby noise resumed, louder now, forced, as if everyone needed proof that things were still normal. But the damage was already done. The violence had not been hidden. It had been routine. And that was the part that would matter most. IR3 smelled like old coffee and disinfectant that never quite erased what had happened there before. The door shut behind them with a dull thud that seemed louder than it should have been. Mitchell shoved Andrew into the chair across from the metal table. Andrew sat without being told twice. He placed his hands flat on the surface, palms down, fingers relaxed. That calm made Mitchell bristle. "Let's try this again," Mitchell said, circling the table instead of sitting. "Why are you really here?" Andrew looked up at him. "I already told you." "That's not an answer." "It is," Andrew said evenly. "Just not the one you want." Mitchell slammed both hands onto the table. The sound cracked through the room. Andrew didn't flinch. Wilson leaned against the door, arms crossed, eyes sharp. She was already assembling the report in her head. The language, the order of events, the words that would turn force into justification. "You refused to identify yourself," she said, testing the sentence aloud. "You became agitated." Andrew turned to her. "I identified myself. You ignored it." Wilson smiled thinly. "That's not how it's going to read." Mitchell stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You walk into my station like you own the place. You don't answer questions. You think that tone is going to save you." "This isn't about saving me," Andrew replied. "It's about what you're doing." That was when Mitchell lost patience. He grabbed Andrew by the collar and yanked him halfway out of the chair. Andrew's hands came up instinctively, not to strike, just to steady himself. "He's resisting," Wilson said loudly, her voice carrying through. The door. Andrew's feet slid back as Mitchell forced him down again. The chair scraped the floor. "Stop," Andrew said, still calm. "This is unnecessary." The words landed wrong. Too measured. Too sure. Mitchell shoved Andrew forward. His forehead struck the edge of the table. The impact was wet and sharp. Andrew slumped back, stunned, blood already spilling from the cut above his eyebrow. For a moment, no one spoke. Mitchell stepped back, breathing hard. "You shouldn't have resisted." Andrew lifted his hand, touched the blood, looked at it. When he raised his eyes again, there was no anger in them, just recognition. "This is exactly what you did before," he said quietly. Mitchell froze. "What did you say?" 3 years ago, Andrew continued. "Same room, my brother." The color drained from Mitchell's face. Outside the room, Tyler Brooks stared at his phone, the video still recording, his hands shaking now. He had never seen fear move so fast across a man's face. Clara Williams watched the time stamp tick forward on her screen. She marked it. Every second, every word. Inside IR3, Wilson shifted her weight, uneasy for the first time. "Enough," she said. "We're done here." But it was already too late. Andrew leaned back in the chair, blood drying on his skin, voice steady despite the pain. "You think this room belongs to you," he said. "You think the silence protects you." Mitchell said nothing. He couldn't. The confidence that had carried him through 100 similar moments was gone, replaced by something thin and brittle. Outside, the station kept moving. Radios crackled, phones rang, officers laughed too loudly. But beneath the noise, something irreversible had begun. The story was no longer theirs to write. Blood pooled on the edge of the table and slid slowly toward the floor. Andrew stayed seated, stunned but conscious, the room narrowing and widening with each breath. The cut above his eyebrow throbbed. He tasted metal. Still, he did not raise his voice. Mitchell backed away as if he had crossed into unfamiliar territory. His hands trembled. He clenched them into fists, then forced them still. "You did that to yourself," he said, the words brittle. "You resisted." Andrew looked up at him, eyes clear despite the blur. "You know that's not true." Wilson stepped forward, urgency replacing control. "Enough. We're done talking." She reached for her radio, then stopped herself. "We need to slow this down." Mitchell laughed once, sharp and hollow. "Slow it down? He just accused me of murder." Andrew didn't accuse. He named. "Brandon Harris," he said again, softer this time. "My brother." The name landed like a weight. Mitchell's face betrayed him before he could stop it. A flicker. Recognition, fear. Gone too fast to explain away, but not fast enough to hide. Wilson saw it. Her jaw tightened. "What do you know about that case?" Andrew leaned back, careful with his balance. Enough to know this room didn't change. Silence pressed in. Outside IR3, Tyler Brooks sat at the dispatch desk with his screen pulled close. He had stepped away from the window, heart racing, pretending to review call codes. Instead, he pulled up the internal calendar. He scrolled, stopped, scrolled back. His throat went dry. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, City Hall, swearing and ceremony. Mayor, City Council, media, Chief of Police. Brooks stared at the name listed beneath the event. He read it twice to make sure his eyes weren't filling in what he wanted to see. He stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway. Inside IR3, Wilson had already shifted gears. "We're holding him," she said quietly to Mitchell. "Overnight." "For what?" Mitchell snapped. "Disorderly, resisting, threats. We can justify it." She lowered her voice. "We can control the timeline." Mitchell wiped his hands on his pants. "Call Walsh." Wilson nodded. "Now." Andrew listened, piecing together the plan as they spoke around him, like he wasn't there. The words were familiar. Transfer, processing delay, paperwork complications, everything that sounded reasonable when written carefully. "This is what you do," Andrew said. "You bury people in procedure." Mitchell spun back toward him. "You don't get to lecture me." "I'm not," Andrew replied. "I'm documenting." Wilson paused, eyes narrowing. "You're bleeding. You need medical." "After you're done," Andrew said. From the hallway, Brooks stopped short of the door. He could hear voices raised just enough to confirm what he feared. He looked back at the calendar on his screen, then at the phone in his hand. He swallowed. The choice was no longer abstract. Inside the room, Mitchell paced, adrenaline turning into panic. "If he shows up tomorrow—" "He won't," Wilson cut in. "Not if we do this right." Andrew closed his eyes, for a second steadying himself. When he opened them, his voice was calm again. "You're not stopping tomorrow," he said. "You're making it worse." Mitchell stared at him, anger flashing, then something else beneath it. Doubt. Outside, Brooks took a breath and started recording again. The system had shifted from violence to strategy, and that was when it became truly dangerous. Deputy Chief Raymond Walsh arrived without sirens. That alone told Andrew everything. Walsh stepped into IR3 with the confidence of a man who believed problems were temporary and power was permanent. His uniform was pressed, his tone calm. He took in the blood on the table, the tension in Mitchell's posture, the way Wilson stood slightly too close to the door. "What's going on?" Walsh asked, already knowing the answer he wanted. Mitchell spoke first. He came in aggressive, refused to identify himself, started making threats. Andrew looked at Walsh. "You're going to write that down." Walsh met his gaze without flinching. "I'm going to write what my officers observed." "That's how you did it last time," Andrew said. Closed the file before anyone could read it. Walsh's expression barely shifted, but his eyes did. Just for a moment. Wilson moved in smoothly. "We think it's best to hold him overnight. Let things cool off. We can process him in the morning." Walsh nodded, as if the idea had been his. "That sounds reasonable." Andrew laughed quietly. It surprised all of them. "You're not even pretending anymore," he said. "You're just moving the clock." Mitchell snapped. "You don't get to decide what we do." "No," Andrew replied. "You just show everyone how you do it." Walsh raised a hand. "Enough. This doesn't need to escalate." "It already has," Andrew said. "You're just choosing paperwork over accountability." Walsh leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You're in a vulnerable position. No one here knows who you are. No one has to." Andrew met his eyes. "That's the point." In the hallway, Tyler Brooks stood frozen, phone tucked against his palm. He could hear Walsh's voice through the door, measured and practiced. He recognized it from training videos, from speeches about leadership. It sounded different up close. Brooks glanced back at the calendar one more time. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. He stepped away from the door and headed back to dispatch. Clara Williams was already there, headphones on, fingers flying. She didn't look up when Brooks approached. "They're trying to hold him," Brooks whispered. "I know," Clara said. "They're switching channels." She tapped the screen, pulling up archived logs. They always do when they think time is on their side. Brooks swallowed. "There's a ceremony tomorrow." Clara paused, just for a second. Then she nodded. "I saw." Back in IR3, Walsh straightened. "We're transferring him to county holding," he said. "Standard procedure." Andrew leaned forward, blood flaking dry against his skin. "You did that to my brother. Overnight. He didn't make it to morning." The room went quiet. Mitchell looked away. Wilson stared at the floor. Walsh exhaled slowly. "That's not what happened." "That's what you wrote," Andrew replied. "And you believed that was enough." Walsh stepped back, his voice hardening. "This conversation is over." He turned toward the door. Behind him, Andrew spoke one last time, his voice steady, almost gentle. "You think this ends because you lock a door. You think silence still works." Walsh stopped. Andrew continued. "It doesn't. Not anymore." Outside, Brooks hit upload. Across the building, Clara saved the final log and backed it up twice. Inside IR3, Mitchell felt the weight of the walls closing in. The plan was moving. The system was doing what it had always done. But for the first time, it felt rushed, desperate, as if even it understood that control was slipping. And somewhere between the blood on the table and the quiet determination of people who had decided not to look away, the future began to tilt. Not loudly, inevitably. The room felt smaller the longer Andrew sat there, not because of the walls, but because the certainty Mitchell and Walsh had walked in with was beginning to collapse under its own weight. Control only worked when everyone believed in it, and belief was slipping. Walsh checked his watch for the third time. "We'll transfer him within the hour," he said, more to reassure himself than anyone else. "County will handle intake." Andrew lifted his head slightly. Blood had dried along his eyebrow, dark and stiff. His voice, when he spoke, was calm enough to feel out of place. "You're running out of time," he said. Mitchell scoffed. "You don't get to talk like that." Andrew looked at him, really looked at him, the way someone does when they're done arguing. "Craig," he said. Mitchell stiffened. "How do you know my name?" "I know a lot of names," Andrew replied. "I know Brandon Harris. I know Linda Wilson signed off on 3 altered evidence logs the week my brother died. I know Raymond Walsh approved a channel switch at 1814 that night and claimed the radio malfunctioned." Walsh's face hardened. "That information isn't public." "No," Andrew said. "It's federal." Silence dropped hard into the room. Mitchell's mouth opened, then closed again. "You're bluffing." Andrew shook his head slightly. 18 months. That's how long the investigation's been running. DOJ, FBI, Civil Rights Division. Quiet, on purpose. Wilson's voice came out tight. "Then why are you here alone?" Andrew met her eyes. "Because evidence tells you what happened. Culture tells you why it keeps happening." Walsh laughed once, sharp and controlled. "You think walking in here was brave. It was reckless." "It was deliberate," Andrew corrected. "I wanted to hear how you speak when you think no one important is listening." Mitchell felt something cold settle in his stomach. The voice, that calm, steady voice. It hadn't wavered once, not when he was slammed into the wall, not when his head hit the table, not now. In the hallway, Tyler Brooks watched his phone upload bar inch forward. 90%, 95. He hadn't told anyone. He hadn't asked permission. He had just acted. Clara Williams leaned over his shoulder. "Once it's live," she said quietly, "they can't make it disappear." Brooks nodded. His hands were shaking, but he didn't stop it. Inside IR3, Walsh stepped closer to Andrew. "Let's be clear," he said. "You don't have standing here." Andrew tilted his head slightly. "I do tomorrow morning." Mitchell blinked. "What does that mean?" Andrew let the silence stretch just long enough. "Tomorrow at 8 a.m. He said, "I take the oath as chief of police." The words didn't land at first. They hovered, unreal, waiting for permission to exist. Mitchell laughed, too loud. "That's impossible." Andrew's eyes never left his. "Check the calendar." Wilson's breath caught. "There is," Andrew said. "Mayor, city council, media. It's been on the internal schedule for weeks." Walsh felt his pulse spike. He knew the calendar. He had skimmed it without reading. A swearing-in ceremony he hadn't bothered to attend to yet. He pulled out his phone, and in that moment, Craig Mitchell understood something too late. The voice he had dismissed, the calm he had mocked, the man he had put his hands on, none of it had been accidental. And whatever future Mitchell thought he had walked into that afternoon was already gone. Walsh stared at his phone, scrolling faster than his eyes could keep up. There it was, buried between routine meetings and budget briefings. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, City Hall, swearing-in ceremony, Chief of Police, Andrew Harris. Walsh looked up slowly. "This doesn't change anything," he said, though his voice had lost its edge. "You're not sworn in yet." Andrew nodded. "That's true, but you are being investigated right now." Mitchell felt the room tilt. "You set us up." "I gave you a chance." Andrew replied. "You chose what to do with it." Wilson shook her head. "This is entrapment." Andrew's tone didn't change. "No. Entrapment is when law enforcement induces a crime. I walked in and said almost nothing. Everything that happened after that was voluntary." The door cracked open. Tyler Brooks stood there, pale but steady. "Sir," he said, voice tight, "the video's uploaded. Multiple servers. Time stamped." Mitchell spun on him. "You recorded this?" Brooks didn't flinch. "I recorded what happened." Walsh's jaw tightened. "You just destroyed your career." Brooks swallowed. "I didn't join to protect lies." Andrew watched him for a long moment. "Thank you, Officer Brooks." The hallway filled with footsteps, not rushed, controlled. Federal agents stepped into view, jackets visible, badges out. The lead agent spoke calmly. "Andrew Harris?" Andrew stood, careful with his balance. "That's me." "You're no longer detained," she said. "We're taking it from here." Mitchell backed toward the wall. "This is a misunderstanding." The agent looked at him. "Sir, you assaulted a federal witness under investigation." Wilson's knees weakened. "Witness." Andrew met her eyes. "And complainant." Walsh stepped forward. "This department can handle internal discipline." The agent shook her head. "Not anymore." Handcuffs came out. Mitchell's face drained of color. "You can't do this." Andrew's voice was soft. "You already did." As Mitchell was cuffed, his eyes locked onto Andrew's. "You let this happen." Andrew nodded once. "I listened." Outside IR3, officers gathered, watching as Walsh and Wilson were escorted down the hallway. No one spoke. No one laughed. The silence felt different now. Andrew touched the dried blood at his temple, then looked at Brooks. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "we start over." Brooks nodded, tears threatening but unashamed. As the agents led Mitchell away, he finally understood. It hadn't been the cameras. It hadn't been the files. It hadn't even been the investigation. It was the voice he dismissed, calm, precise, unafraid, and it had rewritten his future. The price arrived quietly. There was no announcement, no dramatic speech, just the soft click of handcuffs in a hallway that had seen too many people led through it without consequence. Craig Mitchell stood frozen as the federal agent read his rights. The words washed over him, familiar phrases he had recited to others for years, now landing on his own body like foreign language. His badge was removed without ceremony. It felt lighter in his hand than it ever had. Sergeant Linda Wilson did not argue. She straightened her uniform, the habit of control still clinging to her posture even as it slipped away. When the cuffs closed around her wrist, her eyes scanned the faces of the officers watching. Some looked shocked, some looked relieved, some looked away. Deputy Chief Raymond Walsh tried once more to speak, not to the agents, but to the room. "This department has procedures," he said, voice strained. "This will be handled appropriately." No one answered him. The authority that once filled the space around him was gone. It had not been taken by force. It had evaporated. Officers lined the hallway, shoulder to shoulder, the same hallway where they had learned when to laugh, when to stay silent, when to let things slide. Now they stood watching as three figures they had followed, feared, or relied on were escorted past. Them. The question hung heavy in the air, unspoken but unavoidable. Where had you stood? Some officers stared straight ahead, faces rigid. Others watched closely, eyes narrowed, calculating what this meant for them. A few lowered their heads, the weight of memory pressing down all at once. Andrew Harris did not watch them leave. He remained in IR3, alone. The room felt unchanged. Same table, same chair, same faint stain on the floor that never quite faded, no matter how often it was scrubbed. He stood slowly, every movement careful, and placed his hand on the cold metal edge of the table. This was where Brandon had died. The same pressure, the same impatience, the same certainty that no one important would ever care enough to ask questions. Andrew closed his eyes. For a moment, the noise of the station faded. He could hear his brother's voice again, not from that night, but from years earlier, laughing, talking too fast, dreaming about things he never got the chance to finish. "I should have been here," Andrew whispered. He knew that wasn't true. He knew the system was designed to work exactly the way it had, but knowing that didn't dull the ache. A knock sounded at the door. Andrew didn't turn. "Give me a minute." The door stayed closed. Outside, the station was changing in ways that could not be reversed. Federal agents moved through offices, collecting files, sealing evidence rooms. Phones rang unanswered. Supervisors who had once spoken with certainty now asked careful questions. Officer Tyler Brooks stood near dispatch, his phone finally back in his pocket. His hands were still shaking. He had done what he believed was right, and the cost of that decision was only beginning to surface. Clara Williams sat at her desk, watching agents copy logs she had protected for years. When one of them looked up and nodded at her, something loosened in her chest. She had not imagined this moment would feel like relief. Back in IR3, Andrew opened his eyes and stepped back from the table. The pain in his head pulsed, but it grounded him. It reminded him why he was here. This was not victory. This was accounting. The department had lost more than positions and pensions that afternoon. It had lost the lie that it could protect itself forever. It had lost the comfort of silence. And for those who had built their identities around that silence, the cost was everything. Andrew straightened his shoulders. Tomorrow morning, he would take an oath. Tonight, the reckoning had begun. By the time night settled over the city, the station no longer felt like a place of routine. It felt exposed. Doors that had always stayed closed were open now. Evidence boxes lined the hallway floors, tagged and numbered. Officers whispered instead of joked. No one knew who would be called next. No one knew which silence would be reinterpreted as complicity. The loss was not financial. That would come later. What vanished first was control. Craig Mitchell sat in a holding room 2 floors down, staring at the wall like it might explain how a normal Tuesday had ended here. His hands shook uncontrollably now. Not from fear of prison, not yet. From something worse, irrelevance. The badge that once gave his words weight was gone. His voice, once loud enough to end conversations, now barely carried past his own chest. Sergeant Linda Wilson waited in a separate room, posture still upright, eyes empty. She had spent years believing she was the adult in the room, the one who kept things from falling apart. Now she understood the truth she had avoided. She hadn't protected the department, she had protected abuse. Deputy Chief Walsh said nothing at all. The confidence that had wrapped around him like armor was useless now. Without subordinates to echo his authority, he was just a man with a paper trail and no place to hide. Upstairs, officers gathered in small groups, speaking in low tones. "I didn't know," someone said. "But you suspected," another replied. That was the question that refused to go away. Andrew walked the hallway slowly, passing faces that could not decide whether to look at him or look away. Some nodded in quiet respect. Some watched him like he was a mirror they did not want to face. He stopped near the lobby and rested his hand against the wall where the plaster had cracked earlier that evening. The mark was already being repaired. Maintenance moved fast when the damage was visible. He thought of how quickly the building fixed itself and how slowly it had ever fixed people. Officer Brooks approached him hesitantly. "Sir," he said, then stopped, unsure which title applied yet. Andrew turned. "You did the right thing." Brooks swallowed. "I just didn't want to be the guy who stayed quiet." Andrew nodded. That's how this starts, with one person deciding not to be that guy. Across the room, Clara Williams watched them. For the first time in decades, she felt seen without fear. The department would issue statements. Lawyers would argue. Pundits would debate language and intent and policy. That was inevitable. But inside these walls, something had already shifted. People were remembering moments they had dismissed, looks they had ignored, files they had never opened. The weight of those memories pressed differently now. Andrew returned to IR3 one last time before leaving for the night. He stood in the doorway, taking in the room without stepping inside. "This ends here," he said quietly, to no one and everyone at once. He knew tomorrow would not be easier. Reform never was. Trust did not rebuild itself overnight. Some officers would resist, some would leave, some would fight to keep the old ways alive, but the culture had cracked, and cracks once exposed to light tend to grow. As Andrew turned off the hallway light and walked toward the exit, he felt the finality of it settle in. The price had been paid, not in money, not in titles, but in the loss of the lie that power could exist without consequence. And for the first time since his brother died, Andrew felt something close to peace, not because justice was finished, but because it had finally begun. The ceremony began at 8 sharp. City Hall was full in the way rooms get full when people sense history before they understand it. Cameras lined the back wall. Reporters whispered. Community leaders sat shoulder to shoulder with officers who had not yet decided how they felt about what came next. Andrew Harris stood at the front in dress uniform. He did not cover the wound. The stitches above his eyebrow were clean but visible. A thin line cutting across skin still bruised. He could have asked makeup to soften it. Someone had offered. He said no. The room needed to see it. When he raised his right hand to take the oath, the flash of cameras reflected off the glass podium. For a moment, the city saw what the system usually erased: proof, consequence, continuity. "I swear," Andrew said, his voice steady, "to uphold the Constitution, to protect the rights of every person, and to serve this city with integrity, without fear or favor." The words landed differently coming from a man who had bled inside the building he was about to lead. Applause followed, but Andrew did not smile. Not yet. Later that morning, he returned to the station not as a visitor, not as a test, but as chief. The first order he signed reopened the file marked Brandon Harris. Not quietly, not internally. He requested every case tied to use of force during mental health calls over the last 5 years. He mandated body cameras that could not be disabled without documented cause. He established a civilian oversight board with real authority, not symbolic seats. Training schedules changed. Crisis response units were expanded. Policies rewritten in plain language instead of liability phrasing. Some officers welcomed it. Some bristled. Andrew expected both. He called Tyler Brooks into his office. That afternoon, Brooks stood stiffly, still not used to being noticed for doing the right thing. Andrew handed him a folder. "Detective Brooks," he said. Brooks blinked. "Sir?" "You documented truth when it was inconvenient," Andrew replied. "That's the job." Brooks nodded, swallowing emotion he hadn't prepared for. Claire Williams was recognized at roll call that evening, not with a plaque, but with acknowledgement. Andrew spoke her name and explained why it mattered. "She kept records when silence was easier," he said, "because truth needs someone to guard it." Clara looked down, then up again, her eyes wet but unafraid. That night, Andrew walked past IR3 one last time. The door was open, the table clean, the stain gone. He paused, then kept walking. Justice, he knew, was not about punishment. It was about exposure, about letting systems see themselves clearly enough to change. And in the end, it wasn't a threat or a weapon that rewrote the future of that station. It was a voice, calm, precise, unwilling to disappear, the voice he dismissed.